Hey there, so this is an introductory video on Chapter 11, so 11.1, Measurement with Non-Standard and Standard Units. So I just want to talk first about, what do we do when we're working with kids and we're starting to teach them how to measure things, how do we even go about that? So, you know, all of us as adults have probably measured things in the past, but when we step back and we think about like, well, when we measure something, what does that mean? So usually we're finding something to measure, so that's why I put on the note select an object. So for example, maybe I want to measure, my table. And then I have to select an attribute. So that just means like, what am I measuring about my table? So am I measuring the length of my table, for example? Am I measuring the width of my table? Am I measuring the height of my table? So those are some things that I could measure of a table, for example. I put those on top of each other because I consider these all pretty much the same thing. They're all one-dimensional. So 1D measurements, or I could think of them as linear measurements. An example of this in real life might be like if someone wants to get a countertop, for example, even though a countertop has multiple dimensions, it's got space on it. If you go to, the hardware or the Home Depot or Lowe's or something and you're looking for countertops, they always advertise the price per linear foot. And that just means measure how long you need, one dimension, and then we'll give you a price. So these are essentially all the same attribute. The other thing that you could measure, so another type of attribute in 2 dimensions would be area. So for example, how big is the top of my table? So what's the area of the top of my table? That would be in 2 dimensions because now we're measuring, maybe a square or rectangle or, a 2-dimensional shape. When we're measuring linear measurements like 1 dimensions, these are measurements like meters or feet or inches. When we're measuring in 2 dimensions like area, this might be meters squared, square feet, square inches, square yards. So we put a little square with the unit to indicate that we're measuring an area or a 2-dimensional space. Next, so we did 1D, 2D, now we'll talk about 3 dimensions. So if we're measuring a 3rd dimension or 3-dimensional attribute, we're talking about volume. And I wouldn't measure the volume of my table, for example, because that wouldn't make sense, because volume talks about how much space something can hold. So it has to be an object that can actually be filled with something. So for an example, it might be, you're shopping for a refrigerator and they advertise that the refrigerator has a space of 27 cubic feet. So that's an example of a unit of measurement. So 27 cubic feet, for example, would be, how you might see a refrigerator advertised. And that talks about how much space you could put inside that refrigerator. So if you think about what a foot looks like, so maybe a foot is 12 inches. Well, a cubic foot would be, imagine like a cube that's 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot and 1 foot high. And if a refrigerator advertised being 27 cubic feet, it would be like saying there's 27 of these that fit inside the refrigerator. So those are probably the most common ones that you see most often. The other two that we don't think of as much is weight. So you can measure how much something weighs, and then temperature. Okay. So one way that we like to talk about measurement with kids, like especially younger kids, we start in kindergarten, even through 3rd and sometimes 4th grade, is we use what are called non-standard units to start them off with measuring. And what this does is it allows them to focus on how to measure and not so much get bogged down by the actual units. So an example for length might be, so think of, an object that might be in a classroom that you could measure how long something is with it. So for example, let's say, you want students to measure the chalkboard. And usually you have them estimate first. You might say, how many pencils long is the chalkboard? Or how many paper clips long as a chalkboard? And it might, start a good conversation of, well, it doesn't make sense to measure this really big chalkboard with paper clips. That would take forever. Maybe we should use our pencil instead. Or maybe your hand, or maybe your foot or your shoe. Anything that has length, you can measure how long it is. with area, so now we're measuring a two-dimensional, space. We could also measure area of the chalkboard. So that talks about how much space the chalkboard, takes up. So basically, all of this inside. And to do that, we could take maybe a piece of paper. So you have your, actually, let me start over because that's probably too big compared to a chalkboard. So maybe your paper is this big. And you want students to estimate, well, how many of these are going to fill in the chalkboard? They might estimate, and then they can take their piece of paper and stack them together and, go ahead and fill up the chalkboard and see how many pieces of paper fill it up. So area, we could have paper, basically anything two-dimensional. Okay, and then with volume, we're looking for things that are three-dimensional, so that would fill up, space. So maybe it's a recycle bin, or if you're working with younger kids, maybe there's a sensory table in the room. So oftentimes we see these in pre-K classrooms where we've got this table and maybe it's filled with rice, or maybe it's filled with water. And we might ask the kids, okay, well, we've got these buckets of water. So imagine, you've got this bucket of water. How many of these does it take to fill up the sensory table? So buckets of water, maybe sand. Okay, you could fill it up with blocks. That would be far less messy, a little bit easier. So anything that has, bulk to it that you're putting in some sort of container that can be filled up.